morning, everyone. My name is Ross Breen, Manager in the Accommodation Development in Fáilte, Ireland. Together with my colleagues in Enterprise Supports, Aileen Deasy and Marion O'Connor, we're delighted to welcome everyone to our insurance webinar. Thanks for taking the time to tune in, and great to see so many of you today. Accommodation Development Division have the responsibility within Fáilte, Ireland for managing the stakeholder relationships relating to insurance, and we're regularly engaged with sectoral bodies to keep up to date on the issues facing your businesses. We know that increased costs, including insurance, are impacting on every business, and therefore to help you navigate the financial environment, this webinar is focusing specifically on managing your insurance. What we want to cover today includes identifying the right level of cover, managing your insurance process, including your renewal, dealing with the claims process, and working with loss adjusters. We're delighted to be joined by our expert today, Kieran McHugh. Kieran is an independent consultant who has previously held senior positions within the insurance industry, including CEO of Lockton Ireland, Marsh Ireland, and Glennon Insurances. Kieran is a chartered insurance broker and a fellow of the Chartered Insurance Institute. He is a non-executive director of Lockton Insurance Brokers, Arkema Insurance, and Insicom. He's on the General Insurance Committee of Brokers Ireland. In his spare time, he's a keen cyclist. His main claim to cycling fame is completing Mount Ventoux 3 times in the one day. So over to you, Kieran.
Good morning, everybody, and thank you, Ross, for that kind introduction. Just in relation to cycling, I spent the last weekend in glorious Kerry sunshine doing the Ring of Beara, so that was a great advertisement for Irish tourism. So thank you to Fáilte Ireland for inviting me to address this audience, and I'd like the address to be as interactive as possible. So there will be time for Q&A at the end of my remarks, but we also will run a couple of polls during the course of the talk, just to get a sense of where you guys are in relation to your insurance affairs. So maybe we might take the first poll now, which relates to costs. So if you might just indicate if over the last couple of years from memory, your insurance costs increased by less or more than 20%. I think the answer might be fairly obvious, but let's get a sense of it anyway. I'm not sure what the gremlins are doing, but will we move on to the next slide while we're waiting for that result? Or we have a result? We'll come back to the result, but just to give you a sense of it, the Hotel Federation did their own survey over the last couple of years and reckoned that costs were up approximately 20%. So I'd be interested to see how that compares. Just by way of introduction, I'm speaking here in my personal capacity. I spent 43 years, as Ross said, as an insurance broker. And I was never an advocate of insurance companies per se, given that it was clients who paid the bills, not the insurance company when you're an insurance broker. I've mentioned COVID, Brexit and Ukraine in the one bullet point there because it's never been my experience that insurance companies will waste a crisis. So you'll see that they will blame COVID, Brexit and most recently the Ukraine. But it's not a recent phenomenon. If you go back to the Twin Towers 20 odd years ago, that it resulted in an insurance crisis of its own, and it also resulted in a 10-year legal battle between insurers and their clients. The insurers argued that it was one event that brought down the 2 towers, whereas the clients argued that it was 2 events. So you can make your own mind on that, but the court did find in favour of the clients. The issues we're facing today have been building over the last decade. You'll be aware that liability premiums have increased over the last number of years, and successive governments have tried to deal with this. In 2016, the government created the Cost of Insurance Working Group, which looked at a number of issues and reported 13 individual times back to government. But the main outcome of those deliberations was the creation of the Judicial Council Bill, which led to the Personal Injury Guidelines, which came into place in April 21. And there has been some good news in the intervening period from April 21. PIAB, the Personal Injuries Assessment Board, have reported that awards are down approximately 42%, although they do accept that the level of acceptance of those awards has decreased from a 50% average to a 30% average. And the timing is quite unique, in fact, because today there will be a ruling made on a case brought by a lady from Waterford, who claimed that the new personal injury guidelines were anti-constitutional. She claimed for a broken ankle and she was looking for between 18 and 32,000 euros, and she was awarded 3,000 euros by PIAB. So she's claimed, or she has pursued this action, and the judge will rule on it today. So if you keep your eye on media over the next 24 hours to 48 hours, you'll see the outcome of that. Now, I can't anticipate what they might say, but the guidelines and the Judicial Council bill was all done by the judiciary, so it'll be interesting to see what the outcome is. So keep an eye on that. Other initiatives are worked on currently is the duty of care. As business owners, you'll be aware that if somebody walks onto your premises and slips and falls, you nearly have a strict liability for any injuries you might suffer as a result of that slip or fall, without any negligence ever being found against you. So the government are working on an amendment of the duty of care to make it less, or to make it more friendly towards owners of operators of premises than it currently is. And whilst I've spent the last couple of minutes talking about liability and liability premiums, there's no doubt about it that property inflation is at the highest level it's been at in the last 10 to 15 years. The current indications are that property building cost inflation is running at about 15%. So I think if you can take a takeaway from this address, I think you need to look at your building sums insured to make sure that they're adequate to rebuild your property, because if not, you will face a problem in the event of a claim with underinsurance. And that doesn't apply just to your business. I think house policies, everybody is facing the same challenge, that the cost of getting work done has increased by about 15% over the last couple of months. Well, sorry, the last 12 months, and certainly exacerbated since the Ukraine. So I think they're important points to note as we move forward. If we could just take the next slide, please. Just focusing on the insurance market, I'm working from left to right. The insurance market consolidation over the period of my career, but certainly in the last 10 years, have been phenomenal. If I were to tell you now that there's 7 global insurers, you probably wouldn't believe me, but that's the number of global insurers that we have. They all seem to start with the letter A, but if you take AXA, AIG, Allianz, and Aviva, that's 4. And that leaves Chubb, Royal Sun Alliance, and Zurich. After that, there's no global insurers. You have some fringe players. You have some fringe players in the US, Travelers. You have a fringe player in Ireland, FBD. But if you're looking for global market capacity, you need one of those 7 insurers, or all of them, depending on the size of your business. Coupled with that, locally, you will have seen a huge amount of consolidation within the broking sector. The day of the broker in the main street in whatever town or wherever has more or less disappeared. They've been acquired and become part of bigger operations. You'll have seen that throughout Munster, you'll see it throughout Leinster, and also it's becoming prevalent in Connacht as well. Why is that happening? Well, firstly, because of the amount of available money through venture capitalists and private equity funds, brokers are able to sell their businesses at a premium, for want of a better term, that they wouldn't have been able to achieve in the last couple of years. And in addition, the cost of running a broking business have increased significantly with compliance, to the point that one would need nearly a full-time compliance person to deal with all the back office relating to central bank requirements. You probably notice if you get a renewal notice from your insurance broker for your motor policy, you'll get an invoice and about 7 or 8 pieces of paper that, generally speaking, without being cynical about it, end up in the bin. But they are all pieces of paper that the central bank insist on being issued with your renewal notice. So that's part of the reason for the consolidation. It just means that the number of brokers has reduced from approximately 300 in 2020. I'm just working from memory, and it reckons that the number will be about 240 by the end of 2022. So it has been quite significant. You're all painfully aware, I stress, that there's a limited, if not zero, appetite for leisure-related business in the Irish insurance market. Anybody with a good tourist-related business idea, the first obstacle they hit is trying to get insurance for the business, and that hasn't improved over the last 2 years. It's got worse, and Brexit hasn't helped. There's a lack of alternative insurers, and whilst there is occasionally new entrants coming into the market, you might find that from time to time a new entrant comes in, promises the sun, the moon and the stars, and when it comes up for renewal the following year, they've exited the market. And people ask, how does that happen? I've used a term that you might or might not be familiar with, NGAs. That's the new phenomenon, managing general agents. And they don't take insurance on board themselves, but they underwrite it on behalf of some of the major players. So the major player will say to an MGA, we want to write public liability insurance, you provide the expertise. They will give them a certain level of capacity to write that business. And if the business proves not to be successful within 12 to 18 months, they withdraw the capacity and the MGA will cease to operate. You've probably seen that phenomenon happening in your own businesses over the last couple of years. So it is a fact of life that insurance availability for people in the leisure sector, tourism sector, is very limited. So we have to work with what we have. I just want to take a poll now of where we are in relation to, as we go on to discuss the process, and just in relation to where you are in relation to recording. So the poll asks a question in relation to accident recording protocols. And I'm just asking simply, would you believe you have a robust accident reporting protocol within your business? As we move through the presentation, I think the next stage is to try and manage the process. So you'll all be familiar that you have a renewal date, and the renewal date comes around once a year, as you know, and you'll get a call from your insurance broker. And a lot of the time you'll find that it goes down to the wire and you're faced with a decision to make overnight as to whether you can renew or not renew at a certain premium. And that process is not in your interest whatsoever. So my first recommendation is 86%, that's fantastic. My first recommendation is that you as a business begin the process 8 weeks ahead of renewal date. You don't wait to be contacted by your insurance broker. You begin the process. So if you're due for renewal on the 1st of March, you start talking to your broker in early January. Bear in mind, your broker has to present your renewal terms to you with 15 working days prior to renewal. That's a requirement of the central bank. And the reason the central bank introduced that was to give you 15 days to seek alternatives if necessary. So you shouldn't think of your renewal date as the 1st of March. In the example I just gave, you should think of your renewal date as the first week in March, and try and get all your terms available in advance of that date to give you enough time to consider your options. To get that process in place, you need to meet with your broker and then agree with him how he's going to present the risk, your risk, to the insurance markets that are available to you. And that requires a professional presentation of the risk, which will include full underwriting information. You've probably seen a survey report on your property, which will include details of the construction, the hazards around the building, if there is a river or whatever, full underwriting information, the health and safety protocol that you have in place by way of your safety statement, any risk management program that you have in place, and also full details of your claims, if there is claims, but that would be settled claims over the previous 5 years, reserves and outstanding claims, mitigation, i.e. a claim has been made against you, but you don't believe you have any responsibility, so you're dealing with the mitigation issues, remedial actions that you've taken to prevent a recurrence, and then the quality of the defence you might have against any claim. All those details would need to be provided as part of your claim experience and as part of the other various headers as the renewal presentation or the professional presentation of your risk. If we can continue on to the next slide, the broker selection is important. The broker needs to have the resources to manage your business, not only at the front office, but also within the back office, because a lot of the work after renewal date will be routine day-to-day inquiries, claims or whatever, or accidents reporting. But the broker's access to the insurance market is critical. The route from you as the client to the insurer can be a circuitous one, involving maybe a local broker, through to a broker in Dublin or elsewhere in the country, maybe to a broker in London, ultimately to an insurer that might be based in London or elsewhere. So that's 5 or 6 different stages, and ultimately you'll find your way to the ultimate insurer. But just think about that process when you're dealing with a claim. Do you really want to be going through 5 different points of communication to report a claim, or to get a settlement of a claim, or to get any involvement in the process of dealing with the claim? So that's an important issue when you're talking to brokers as to their access to the market, the resources that they have to handle your business. And it's not just about the deal on the day one, it's a 365-day deal. If I can give you one recommendation from my experience in broking, if you are seeking an alternative quote from to your incumbent broker, I would use one other broker only. That's not to say I wouldn't talk to other brokers before I make that decision, but I would decide on one broker only to compete with my incumbent broker. And you might ask me why. Well, the reason is if an underwriter in London sees your piece of business from 5 different brokers, he would probably take the view that I'm only wasting my time here because I would give a quote out to 5 different brokers, blah, 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 and he will move on to something that he thinks is more likely to win him the business. If he sees the presentation from one broker only, as in the competing broker, he will take the view that you're making a serious inquiry, that you're serious about placing the business with him, and that they will give it, they will look at it correctly and review it in the terms of putting forward a quotation which might win the business. So sometimes having 5 brokers running around, like, might seem that you've 5 brokers working in 5 different areas. Generally speaking, they'll all end up in the same place. So that's one recommendation you might want to think about. I think I just want to take another poll, and because we're talking about claims over the next couple of minutes, and claims are one of the most contentious areas in my experience. When I was a full-time broker, I dealt with a client, and in terms of employer's liability or public liability claims, there used to be 3 reactions. The first one, was that nothing happened. Secondly, if they accepted that something happened, they may accept that something happened, but there was nothing wrong with the guy. And the third reaction was, no matter what award was made to the guy, it was too much, or it shouldn't have been given at all. So dealing with clients where there's liability claims was part of my life, and I understood it totally, because nobody likes being sued, and nobody likes money being awarded to a third party or an employee when they don't believe there's any genuine claim. So my next question on the poll is in relation to that. I've asked the question, has your insurer engaged with you proactively before settling public liability claims? But equally, it could be employer's liability claims. So think of it as a joint question, and if you might give me some sense of the level of interaction you get with your insurance broker. Well, that's very interesting, and it's a surprise to me actually, but we can talk about that during Q&A. In claims management, the claim happens on the accident happens on your property. Whether it results in a claim or not is another matter, but when the accident happens, there's a number of things you need to do. And I've tried to set it out as simply as possible. You need to use the 4 W's to investigate the accident, as in what happened, where did it happen, why did it happen, and when did it happen. And that document needs to be retained. If the accident was captured by closed circuit TV footage, that's obviously got to be retained and not recorded over tomorrow or the next day. And if it was witnessed, you should collect contemporaneously witness statements signed and dated and also retained. If they're collected 2 weeks later or 2 weeks before the case goes to court, they won't have any evidential value. If they're contemporaneous, they will. For employees where you've trained them in manual handling or whatever else, those records should be retained on their HR records, again, to be used as evidential value. And disclaimers, I'm not a legal person, but from a disclaimer point of view, they do have some effect. So you should use disclaimer notices in your car park area, if you have one in your cloakrooms, wherever you think it's appropriate. But also, if there's any activities within your area of business where you believe getting the client to sign a disclaimer that he's aware that he's taking part in whatever it might be, mountain biking, adventure sports, whatever it is, those disclaimers do have some impact when you're negotiating a settlement with the guy in the event of a loss. So you should consult your legal advisors in relation to those areas to make sure that they're appropriately worded, albeit that disclaimers per se do not have the legal effect you'd like them to have. And then claims management, as we continue into it on the next slide, please. I think I should have headed this slide that it's your money, because ultimately it is your money. The more claims an insurer pays out, the more premium he's going to collect from you. And in addition, at the starting point, you will all have a level of deductible on your policy, be it mandatory in that it's imposed by the insurer, or a voluntary excess where you've agreed to take a certain level of excess on your policy, be it 5,000, 7,500 or 10,000 each claim, either to reduce the level of premium payment or to get the cover in place in the first place. So when insurers are talking about settling claims, it's your money, particularly at that particular area that they're using. So you should be involved in the process at every stage. So if moving vertically, if I can suggest that you should challenge the methodology used by the insurer at every stage of the process. If they're defending it, they need to explain that they're defending it. If they're not defending it, they need to explain why. And the last thing you want them to do is concede and make a nuisance settlement without you being involved in any shape or form in relation to the settlement. So the challenge on that point is very important. You also need to challenge the reserves that they put up against a claim. And when I say reserves, on a claim which is reported, the insurers will put an estimate as to the amount of money they think that claim is going to cost. And insurers never underestimate. I'm sure you're all aware, insurers never underestimate the level of money they're going to pay. They always overestimate it, and it's estimated, in my experience at any rate, that the reserves are normally 25% higher than the ultimate settlement. Bear in mind that for the period that the reserve is in place on your policy, your premium is based on that level of reserve, so you can see how it would have an impact on your premium. So challenging reserves and getting an understanding as to why they're at the level they're at is a very important part of the process, excuse me. And that ultimately leads to the final box, which is where you have paid and settled claims in two columns. The paid claims will be the settled claims over a period of 5 years, possibly. Normally insurers look for 5 years. And in the other column, you'll see a figure for outstanding claims. Sometimes they'll individualize those, other times they just give you a total outstanding figure. But generally speaking, the outstanding figure will far outweigh the paid figure if you compare them on a like-for-like basis. So again, a challenge at that stage, further challenge at that stage, you normally get the experience in advance of a renewal date. A further challenge at that stage will help you understand where the level of reserve is coming from and explain that to either another insurer or another broker that you might be talking to at the time. So I think when I say challenge, when I'm talking about this piece of the business, I think the best example I can give you from my experience is the Supermax experience. Pat McDonough, I think you all know Pat McDonough originally was a teacher, and then he became, his entrepreneurial flair came to the fore, and he became Supermax, and then he's into the hotel business. But after a couple of years' experience of dealing with claimants, Pat McDonough decided that he wasn't going to settle any claim, or no claim was going to be settled on his watch unless it was fully challenged. I'm talking here about spurious claims. I'm not talking about a genuine accident where obviously you would want to see the guy sorted as quickly as possible. So Pat McDonough took this approach maybe 10 years ago, and it's he would talk to it regularly through IOD meetings or whatever. But he explains that by doing that, every guy that comes into McDonald's, if he ends up in a solicitor's office, the solicitor will know that McDonough is going to fight it. The guy himself will know that it's going to be fought, and he will make sure that if he thinks somebody is telling lies, he will put them on the stand and get them to commit perjury on the stand. And as I mentioned earlier, perjury, there was a perjury piece of legislation brought in recently which makes that a criminal offence. So when I say challenge, you might say, well, it's okay for Pat McDonough, but I think everybody has to start doing it, and maybe you're already doing it, and if you are, well done, that you challenge at every stage of the process what your insurer is doing on claims, because ultimately, as I said, if I put this slide, it's your money that they're spending. So that's part of the managing the process that I think you should be very aware of, and maybe you already are. I think I just wanted to conclude my remarks around this time, so give time for interaction and Q&A. And I think what we're going to do is Ross is going to chair the Q&A and take the questions that have been coming through on the chat function over the last 25 minutes. So maybe, Ross, do I pass back to you and stay on screen?
Yeah, thanks very much, Kieran. That was brilliant, very informative. Really appreciate it. So yeah, so we have a number of questions that we've received in advance, and feel free to add in any questions while we're going through the ones that we have already here. So I guess, Kieran, one of the things you started with was obviously the government's reform agenda is well underway. You mentioned that the awards and the new guidelines are down, I think it was 42%. I guess what the businesses want to know is, when's that going to impact on the premiums? And you mentioned this court case today, so being a key thing. So what do we look like in terms of timelines for that?
Okay, well, as I said, it's amazing the timing. So keep an eye on this case. Delaney is the lady's name, and the outcome of that case will be very important because you will see a lot of reaction to it following the decision of the judge. If awards reduced by 42% on an ongoing basis, that's obviously going to have a positive impact on premium. The awards came in April 21, so we've had a full year, and there'd be no impact on premium. But if this continues through 22 and early into 23, I think there's no doubt that there will be a lobby to suggest that the premiums should start reducing sometime towards the back end of next year. The insurers will normally look to a trend over 2 to 3 year period. And without being cynical, if the 2 or 3 year period doesn't reflect the trend, they look to 5 years to try and find a trend that can justify it. But certainly with the reforms that have been put in place over the last 2 years, the government has done remarkable work in terms of timings and everything else, because this isn't a speedboat that you can turn, it's a battleship. So I would anticipate if these trends of 42% continue, you would certainly see in 2023, you would start to see premium reductions.
Okay, great. And then just on related to that reform agenda piece, and you mentioned the legislation in relation to perjury, but you also mentioned the duty of care reform. Do we have any side in terms of, or yourself, in terms of when we think they might be implemented, and then again, will that impact on premiums for businesses down the line?
Yeah, I think everybody in the audience will bristle when they hear about duty reform, because it is one of the problems that a guy, as I said in my remarks, a guy can walk onto your premises, slip and fall for whatever reason. He might have too much drink, or he might have slippy shoes, who knows, but he'll take an action against the occupier or owner of the property, and generally speaking he'll succeed, because the liability for owners of property is nearly a strict liability. So the duty of care has been under review for the last 12 months. A report went to government in April of 22, and it's expected that will become in 23 that will become the norm. Now, it hasn't been finalized in terms of what it'll look like, but it'll certainly be less owners on owner occupiers, and again that'll have an impact because claims can be rebutted, potential claims can be rebutted on the basis that the owner occupier has done nothing wrong. But again, watch that space. It's probably 12 months, Ross. 12
months. Super, Kieran. Thanks, man. Okay, and I guess you mentioned a lot about consolidation and brokers being bought, and I suppose money coming into the industry and that consolidation piece. So I guess the businesses are, people are having trouble getting quotes, and I guess they're asking you. So I guess, why is this going on in terms of the consolidation? Is it going to continue? Is it going to be harder for them to get quotes? And is there anyone that can help them then? If they're having trouble getting quotes.
Yeah, it's a great question. I think let's break it down into the individuals. There's huge capacity out there, insurance capacity, but it's limited to, as I said, 7 or 8 major insurers. So they can sort of dictate the pricing by way of, without using the word cartel, because you can't use that, but there's a certain level of cost that would be across the board. I would suggest, and a number of organisations within the tourism sector have set up their own insurance facilities, be it the Restaurant Association. The one I'm familiar with is the Irish Association of Adventure Tourism. So if I can give the example of one restaurant making a presentation for business to insurer A, is one proposition, but if 100 restaurants make a proposition for insurance to insurer A, the reaction might be stronger. So I think the first thing is you need to talk to your representative body as a group and see is that a potential. Some bodies within the tourism sector have, the Hotel Federation took a view that it wasn't in their best interest, and there's different views on it, but that would be certainly my experience, that the lobby groups or the representative bodies having a purchasing scheme or a scheme of some description tends to work better than ploughing your own furrow. If you
okay, so as a port of call for anyone who's having issues getting a quote, reach out to your representative body as a starting point. Great, thanks, Kieran. Okay, and then there's a few questions about changes to policies. They had policies and the policies come back up, but there's a few ones. So one question: my excess has increased. Is there anything they can do about that in relation, or is that just something we have to bear in terms of the excesses, or is that what's going on there with the insurer in terms of that?
Yeah, I suppose I touched on it, and maybe I should have elaborated on, and if you remind me to come back to excess in the second, but if I can answer a different question first. COVID was a huge issue for everybody, particularly businesses in the hospitality sector, and you saw the reaction of the insurance market in general when COVID happened. They just said that the business interruption covers that you all have in place for years and years and years do not operate. That was the carte blanche answer. In the UK, the Financial Services Authority brought a test case against various insurers, which was successful. Here, the FBD, who had a huge volume of business in the pub sector, refused point blank to deal with the claims and had to be dragged kicking and screaming. There was a 3 pub test case at Lone, the place Lemon and Duke in Dublin, and one other which escapes me, and the court found in favour of FBD. So that was a success in terms of getting your COVID claim dealt with. But of course, since that, COVID is completely deleted from any cover, so there's no chance that this will occur. If we have another pandemic, your policy will not cover it. They've even taken the liberty of deleting some other covers that might have been there in the past, such as Legionnaire's disease and other obscure covers that you might have been aware of or might not. So that's the reaction of the insurance market to COVID. The excess situation, some clients might decide that they'll take an excess on the basis that it might mitigate the premium cost up front, or also they might have greater involvement in the handling of the claims where it's their money that's being used. Where the excess is increased by your insurance company, generally speaking, you're not going to be able to negotiate your way out of that. It's probably been increased across the board. I'm not sure in terms of the question what the level of excess is, but any level of excess can be significant. So it's one for your broker to try and negotiate the best deal around the excess if it's being imposed and increased by the insurer.
Okay, great. Thanks, Kieran. I guess then this is related. You touched on it there. I guess obviously businesses have very difficult 2 years in terms of COVID and shutdowns. So turnover is obviously something that has been used as a calculation for insurers in setting the insurance premiums. How are they going to be calculating turnover now for the new policies, and how should they really be? Is there any comeback there in relation to, obviously businesses have had much reduced turnover based on a difficult market, increased costs in 2022. Is there any scope there to speak to your insurer about how they're calculating that?
Yeah, it's a tricky one. Liability policies, generally speaking, the employer's liability will be based on the payroll, and the public liability will be based on the turnover. And you estimate the turnover for the coming year, and the premium is based around that. But then you come into what insurers call minimum premium. So they might say your turnover is £1 million, but the minimum premium is 10,000 euros. And if you don't achieve £1 million turnover, your premium is still 10,000 euros. So it's these rules, generally speaking, are created by insurers, and they're all insurer friendly. Now, thankfully, COVID is behind us, at least fingers crossed it's behind us, and you will find turnovers increasing. And over the past 2 years, businesses continue to insure their businesses even though they weren't operating. So there might be some grounds to get some rebate back for those periods, but that's something that you would have been expected to challenge to your insurer over the last 2 years. So I'm not sure if I answered the question there, Ross, but it is a difficult area.
That makes sense. It's really to get the sense of that, and I guess we might rerun that first poll on the premium increases.
Yeah, we didn't see the result of it.
Yeah, will be great whenever we get a chance to do that. Okay, then I guess you mentioned the broker there in terms of going to your broker and how important that is. So yeah. I think you mentioned. So the question is, why should I only pick one alternative broker to compete with the incumbent rather than multiple?
Well, it's actually a personal choice for the business owner himself. Well, I'll just give you my experience. If I was the incumbent broker and you're my client, and you told me you were going to 5 different brokers, I'd be delighted. If you told me you were going to one other broker, I'd be saying, Ross is serious about this. The guy that he's gone to is going to take a serious look at this because he knows it's me against him. Whereas if he goes to 5, they'll all sort of say he's only playing around. It's not serious. So I think you should certainly talk to a number of different brokers. You have no problem talking to them because they're ringing you every day of the week. But then you need to make a decision. You're with your incumbent for a certain reason, and the incumbent presumably has been doing a good job, or else you wouldn't be with him. And then you decide on one other equally good or better broker to go against them. That's the way I would decide. I don't think you just pick 5 names out of the hat and just tell them to go and get it. But it's the resources behind the broker that's important, that they have the staff and they have the access to markets, as I said, and the ability to service your account. It's not just a matter of producing a premium and saying, here's magic premium, and then they can't service you over the following 365 days.
No, I understand. And as the person who was on the other side of that relationship with you, Kieran, as the director of finance of the hotels who had to negotiate the insurance, I hear where you're coming from. So one of the key questions, or one of the key things that you took out of the presentation, I thought was very interesting, is reserves. So, and the question is, how do we challenge reserves? How would they go about doing it? How could we successfully argue to have that lowered? Because you mentioned that on your presentation.
Yeah. Well, I think it's like anything. To use a Dublin expression, if you have a reputation for getting up early in the morning, you can stay in bed all day. Okay, so you need to just create an impression with your broker that you're not going to accept. Your broker is the initial point of contact, that you're not just going to accept. He sends you in a claims experience, and there's reserves for $500,000. You want to understand why there's a reserve, or there's a number of claims reserved at $500,000. Can you give me the background? You just need to get on top of this as another item to be dealt with in your in-trade, that you need to be aware of every claim that's against you, why it's reserved, why we're not defending it, and your broker needs to know that that's the level of detail you're going to get involved in, and then he needs to communicate that to the loss adjuster. You probably have meetings with loss adjusters from time to time, but to try and arrange depending on the size of the business, if you can arrange that on a quarterly basis or a half-yearly basis, where you go through the reserves on a line-by-line basis and just take the time out to do that exercise, then they realise that this guy knows what he's talking about, this guy is on top of things, we need to explain where we're coming from with the reserves. And you mightn't be happy with the explanation, but at least you'll have an explanation. At the moment, all you have is a number or several numbers relating to claims. So it's really taking some level of control back within your business rather than just accepting it.
Okay, great. Thanks, Kieran. So any ideas then on solutions for insurance for adventure and activity providers? So, and I know that's been a particularly difficult area. We did work with IAT in terms of group scheme with Aricus. So I'm not sure if that might be the best route for them to go down if they haven't tried that already, but is there anything else you might suggest?
Well, that came up as part of the research for the work I did last year for you, Ross, and I actually suggested that it might be an idea to get that as a test case. Now, by the way, we were just emerging from COVID last May when that scheme kicked off, but I understand it. I've no connection with Arcus other than I was aware that was the provider. But I understand that scheme has been quite successful, and I know from talking to Adrian Cummins, the restaurant scheme has been quite successful. So schemes per se seem to be a way to go, certainly a way to investigate. But you will find counter arguments to that from time to time. But certainly a guy who sets up a stand-up paddleboarding business tomorrow in Connemara and he tries to get insurance for that in his own name, it's just not going to. It's not going to happen. He will have.
Okay, great, Kieran. Thanks. And just because it's a relevant question here, I just want to get to it. So we have a lot of new businesses that started up over the pandemic, especially those outdoor areas, glamping, etc. So you're coming to, I suppose, the industry completely new. You have no history. What's the best steps to start in terms of that insurance process? Just even the basics. Where do you go? Where do you start?
Well, I suppose we're coming back to the same thing. If you have a representative group for glamping or whatever it might be, generally speaking, you look at the hazards related to the business. I'm not sure glamping will be a hazardous business, but it's just that you've got a stream of clients, a bit like B&B, I guess, or hotel. But it's the more hazardous the business looks, generally speaking, the more hazardous the business is in terms of potential claims. So I think You would start as a glamping business. You would start talking to an insurance broker locally, either somebody that's been recommended to you or somebody that you know, and then let them.
Okay, just because there's a related question back here, and then it's how do we find out what brokers have access into the markets? You mentioned there's in terms of appetite for the area, that it's not as great as it was. So again, is that the representative body is probably the best placed?
Well, sorry, your own representative body within the sector, but the brokers are represented by Brokers Ireland, and they would produce document. It's probably online. I'd have to just double check, but that would list all the brokers who have facilities in place for various businesses, and a lot of them will be tourist related, such as Arcus will be strong in that area as well.
Okay, great. And then, do any claimants represent themselves in your experience? Other than
no,
legal?
No. Well, the claimant has two options when he has a potential claim. He can go to PIAB, and PIAB will then give the company against who he's taking the claim 90 days to accept liability, and once liability is accepted, then it goes to PIAB for assessment. Or alternatively, you can say, I'm going legal, I'm going straight to a solicitor, we're going to sue them. There's no gain in it for the guy who has a claim to go and do it on his own. He'll always use a lawyer or go through PIAB. And generally speaking, he's a lawyer to go through PIAB. All
right, so I have a very specific question, Kieran. You might be able to help me on this. And I know we talked about sort of transport, and we touched on it, but we run a small guest house business and provide bikes for our guest use. They can't get insurance. Their existing insurance has excluded it. Can't get anyone else to cover it. Is there any suggestions how we manage this, other than withdrawing the service, which would obviously be disappointing for guests?
Yeah, that's again a sad situation, and I can't fail to understand it. I mean, if you cycle a bike, as I do, for leisure purposes, and you have you fall off the bike, that's not anybody's responsibility. Unless the bike is affected. I think, go back to what I said in my remarks, the way to deal with that for the B&B guest house owner is to get a disclaimer from the person that you're taking the bike out at your own risk, and any claims. I can't see that pushing the insurers are going to change their mind on it. So a disclaimer agreed with your lawyer is probably the best way out of that one.
Okay, fair enough. Okay, and then another question, because we spoke about this earlier, is EL and PL compulsory in Ireland, or just EL? So yeah, well, liability, sorry, and public liability, just in terms of the acronym.
Yeah, well, the answer to the question is they're not compulsory by statute. The only compulsory insurance is motor. In the UK, employer's liability is compulsory, but to all intents and purposes, employers and public liability are compulsory here. In terms of your license, if you're running any sort of entertainment in your hotel, you'll have to produce your public liability insurance before you renew the license. And employer's liability insurance, anybody who sets up a business and employs people and decides not to take out insurance is just looking for trouble. So it's essentially it's a must-have for businesses, even though it's not compulsory by law.
Okay, thank you, Kieran. Okay, well, look, I think that's most of the questions we've gone through. We might rerun the poll now, just on the premiums, just to have that result, because I think it'll be interesting to have it if we could get that done. If you could, so has your premium increased over the period from 2020 to 2022 by less than 20% or by more than 20%? I think Kieran touched on the IHS survey that mentioned it was over 20% for a lot of the members over the last couple of years. We know that obviously premiums have been increasing anyway, leading up to before the pandemic, and now obviously it's still going up. So we just want to get a sense of that. Okay.
Yeah, it's interesting, but it's not surprising. What I'd hope, if I can give you some green shoots, is there are some favourable stats coming out of PIAB, and depending on the outcome of this test case today, if the outcome of the test case today is positive, those trends will continue, and if those trends continue, premiums will begin to reduce, and it will make the market more attractive for insurers to come back into the marketplace. But as I said, it's not going to happen overnight, but certainly you would hope to see it. If those trends continue, you'd hope to see that 2023 will see some improvement in the market conditions.
Okay, that's great, Kieran. Thanks so much. I think you have that's the final Q&A in terms of the questions. So I think you have some top tips you want to just lead us out with.
Yeah. Yeah, thanks, Ross. Yeah, I suppose if we go to the last one first, I think challenge is the way forward. I think use the Pat McDonough example. You don't all have to be Pat McDonough's, but his example is the best one. So broker selection I've mentioned, and I think picking one other broker to compete with incumbent is my recommendation, and he should have access to the insurers, because without access to insurers, you're going through Billy to Jack, and that's not going to get you anywhere. A professional presentation of your risk, as I mentioned, incorporating the various factors, be it health and safety, protocol, risk management, full claims details. And again, remember on the claims process, it's your money. So make sure you're involved at every stage of the process, and challenge. Challenge will be the big word coming out of this.
Okay, great, Karen. That's fantastic. Thanks so much. And if we didn't get to any of your questions or there's more coming in, we'll endeavour to get back to you and be in touch afterwards. So just to wrap up, thank you, Kieran, for what we're trying to do is recommend, as Kieran has said, engage with your business, engage with your insurer as early as possible. Try and, so assign someone in terms of ownership within the business to deal with that relationship. Big thank you to Kieran for his expertise, his practical guidance and advice today. I'd like to take this opportunity to thank everyone who's joined the call. Thank you for staying with us and remaining so engaged. We also have other financial planning supports available on the Fáilte Ireland Business Supports Hub, so please do check out that as well. And there's more to come. There's a calendar there of supports coming. So again, thank you very much for joining today. Really appreciate your time, and take care.